swollen from humidity. The ink half bled into the paper like veins. The discovery was made in 1934, during the demolition of the old Whitlock Plantation in Wilkinson County, Mississippi. By then, the mansion was nothing more than a decaying husk. Caved roof, mildewed walls, vines strangling the balcony rails. The crew had been clearing the library when one of the men pried open a warped drawer and pulled out a small, leather-bound Bible. Its cover cracked like old skin. When he opened it, a folded parchment slid out, brittle and yellowed. Old language, but one sentence, halfway down, stopped them cold. I, Silas Whitlock of Wilkinson County, being of sound mind, do bequeath all lands, holdings, and worldly possessions to my man Isaac. It was signed, dated 1849, and below that, my wife Elizabeth shall have nothing. At first the men laughed, assuming it was a forgery or a cruel joke. But the courthouse records confirmed its authenticity, filed, sealed, and never contested. The locals had heard whispers about the Whitlocks for generations, a plantation once cursed, a family name erased, and a black man, once a slave, who inherited everything. No one ever found Isaac's grave. No one ever found Elizabeth's either. But the house had stories. Neighbors said that on some nights, when the wind turned over the fields, you could hear a woman crying softly in the trees behind where the mansion used to stand, and sometimes, if you walked too close to the ruins, you'd find footprints in the ash, barefoot, small, but deep. Before we continue with the story of Silas Whitlock and the will that damned a family name, join our community of mystery lovers. Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten stories like this one. In the mid-1800s, Wilkinson County was a world of contradictions, a land rich in soil and sin. Situated on the edge of the Mississippi River basin, it was a place where fog hung low over the cotton fields and the sound of insects never ceased. The town of Woodville sat at its heart, a collection of whitewashed buildings, a courthouse square, and a single cobbled street lined with storefronts selling everything from salt pork to scripture. On Sundays, the church bells called to the pious and the damned alike. The hymns rolled through the valley, thin and tremulous, while the enslaved stood at the edges of the fields, alone, but in lives, each man, woman, and child, reduced to an entry on a ledger. The Whitlock Plantation was among the oldest and most feared. Built in 1811, it stretched over 1,000 acres of red clay and river bottom. The mansion itself was 2 stories of whitewashed brick, with tall Greek columns and dark shutters that never stayed open. Locals said it was haunted even then. When his father died. He was known to be quiet, educated, unusually gentle for a man of his station. His neighbors called him the philosopher planter. He read Latin, corresponded with abolitionists in secret, and, some said, confessed to the local preacher that sin was a seed sown deep in the soil. He was also wealthy beyond imagination. Hundreds of acres of cotton, dozens of enslaved men and women, a wife from a good Southern family, and a reputation as both eccentric and righteous. She came from the McCullen family of Natchez, a lineage steeped in money, cruelty, and the gospel in equal measure. She and Silas had no children, and that, according to legend, was the beginning of the curse. In an age when a man's bloodline was his immortality, childlessness was not a tragedy. It was a death sentence of the soul. Elizabeth's letters, a few of which survived in the county archive, suggest growing paranoia and religious mania. He sits among them as though they were his kin, I do not know what spirit has overtaken my husband, but I fear it is not the Lord's. By them, she likely meant the enslaved families on the Whitlock land, particularly one man named Isaac, who appears repeatedly in surviving documents. Isaac's name first shows up in the Plantation inventory of 1839. Isaac, male, 20 years of age, field hand, literate, carver of fine wood. 10 years later, he is listed not as property but as manager of works. That was unheard of. Slaves did not manage anything. Neighbors muttered that Silas was gone strange, that he had made a pet of Isaac. But there are deeper clues in the oral histories passed down through black families in the region. One account, recorded in the 1930s by the WPA, describes Isaac as a tall man with gray eyes, could read the Bible like a preacher, and didn't fear no master. Another woman, interviewed in 1937, said, "Old Isaac, he was the one they said the master trusted with everything. They say the white lady hate him for it. She say he was witching her husband with books and moon prayers." Whether Isaac truly practiced any kind of spiritual rite, no record survives. But we do know that something changed in that house during the final years before Silas's death. Letters ceased. The plantation ledger stops listing new purchases. And in the winter of 1849, the doctor from Natchez was called out 3 times in 1 month. Once for Silas, once for Elizabeth, and once for a servant, name withheld. The doctor's journal, rediscovered in 1929, contains one cryptic note beside the December 14th entry. The smell of sulfur about the house, the lady unwell, the man silent. Sulfur. That word would come up again, decades later, in the accounts of those who visited the abandoned plantation after the war. They said the earth there was scorched in strange patterns, that nothing would grow where the master's library once stood. But before the ruin there was a will, and the will was no accident. When Silas died in March of 1849, the county clerk recorded the event simply: Whitlock, Silas J., male, white, 43. Cause, collapse of heart. No autopsy, no suspicion, only whispers. The will was read 2 days later. Elizabeth fainted upon hearing it. Witnesses said she did not speak again for a week. The language of the document is cold, deliberate, almost tender in places. To my wife Elizabeth, I leave my forgiveness, for she has suffered much and loved little. To my man Isaac, of, to be held in perpetuity and used with charity. That phrase, in perpetuity, was unusual. It meant forever. It meant Isaac was not merely freed. He was heir. Legally, it should never have stood. A slave could not inherit under Mississippi law. Yet, the will was filed, signed by 2 witnesses who later vanished from record. No one contested it. Elizabeth left the county within the month. Some say she went mad, others that she joined her kin in Natchez and lived in seclusion until her death. The plantation passed quietly into limbo, neither seized nor sold. During the war, it was looted and burned. And yet, the story did not die. For nearly a century, travelers reported strange lights in the ruins, and locals claimed to see a man's figure, tall, dark, walking the fields where nothing grew. The Whitlock name faded, but Isaac's remained, whispered in both fear and reverence. Who was he? Why would a man like Silas Whitlock risk everything, his fortune, his name, his soul, to give it all to a man the world called property? Some said it was guilt. Others said love. And a few, quietly, after dark, said it was something else entirely. Something born not of compassion, but of a pact. Because in those years, when the Mississippi moon was red and the river swelled with dead leaves and bones, men spoke of deals made at crossroads, deals that promised freedom at a price too heavy to name. And when Silas Whitlock signed his will, he may have signed more than a document. He may have signed his damnation. The people of Wilkinson County never spoke openly of the Whitlocks again. The house was left to decay, its timbers sinking into the mud. By the time the Civil War ended, the estate had become little more than a scar, a tangle of vines and charred foundations. Yet the story lived on in fragments. A rusted cross found where the chapel once stood, a silver locket bearing Elizabeth's initials unearthed by a farmer, and the Bible, the same Bible in which the will had been hidden, rediscovered 85 years later. Inside its front cover, someone had written, in a hand too shaky to be Silas's, "He walks still, and the land is his." The Whitlock plantation still exists, at least in memory. Its ghosts have names, and its sins wore human faces. To understand the will that destroyed a family and birthed a legend, we must know the people whose lives it bound together. Each one played their part. A husband who carried secrets like scripture, a wife whose faith turned to madness, and a man whose silence outlasted them both. Silas Whitlock was born in 1806 to a family already stained with blood and wealth. His father, Jeremiah Whitlock, had come from Virginia, a man of the old frontier stock, brutal and industrious. The elder Whitlock made his fortune in cotton and sugar, buying enslaved families by the dozen. The stories say he was a man of God on Sunday and a devil the rest of the week. Silas, his only son, was different, or so the locals claimed. He was pale, almost sickly as a boy, preferring books to rifles, solitude to company. He studied at a small college in Natchez and returned home with a new way of speaking, soft, deliberate, too refined for the rough soil of Mississippi. He read Emerson, quoted scripture with unease, and refused to attend the slave auctions that other planters treated like sport. The townsfolk didn't trust him. They called him the Quiet Whitlock. In person, he was striking in that unnerving, almost otherworldly way that still photographs can never capture. His eyes were light gray, his hair black as ink. He rarely smiled. People said he looked like a man who had seen the end of the world and decided to live with it. Silas's closest companion was not his wife, nor any of the planters in the county, but his overseer's assistant, a young enslaved man named Isaac. Isaac was born on the Whitlock land in 1819, the son of a field hand named Ruth and an unknown father, though rumor had long suggested that Jeremiah Whitlock himself was the man responsible. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and unusually calm. He could read, a skill whispered about but never confirmed, and he could build almost anything with his hands. Fences, barns, cabinets, even small toys carved from oak for the plantation children. The old ledgers call him a carpenter of fine detail. There are no surviving portraits of Isaac, no photographs, no drawings. But in the oral accounts passed down among freedmen's descendants, he is described as a man who looked at you like he already knew your sin. He rarely spoke above a whisper. He didn't need to. The bond between Silas and Isaac was strange, layered with something no one could quite name. In the spring of 1843, when a fever swept through the enslaved quarters, Silas himself tended to the sick. Witnesses said he and Isaac went from hut to hut, wiping sweat from foreheads, burning rags soaked in vinegar. One woman, whose grandmother had been there, recalled, "They say Master Silas prayed over the dying, but not like no preacher I ever heard. He said the word soft, like he was begging the Lord not to look too close." Isaac was always beside him, silent. After that fever passed, something between them changed. Silas began allowing Isaac into the main house. He taught him to write his name. At night they were seen reading by candlelight in the study, the master reading aloud while Isaac traced words with his finger. One night, Elizabeth Whitlock came down the stairs and found them that way. The two men seated together at the table, the candle burning low, the house silent but for the sound of Silas's voice. She would later tell a friend, in a letter now half burned at the edges. He looked at that man the way a priest looks at an altar, both fearful and needing. I cannot abide the sight of it. Elizabeth Whitlock, née McCullen, was born in 1810 in Natchez, the daughter of a shipping magnate and his devout, unrelenting wife. She was raised to be ornamental, delicate in manner, cold in temperament, educated just enough to charm a husband. Her beauty was her currency. Pale hair, long neck, eyes the color of river glass. But behind that face, there was a sharpness. Her diaries, discovered long after her death, reveal a woman tormented by jealousy, religion, and guilt. "The Negroes whisper at night," she wrote in 1845. "They call my husband's name in their songs. I wake to find the Bible open on the floor, pages torn. Isaac stands in the yard at dawn as if he prays to the trees. I think the devil has made his home here." In public, Elizabeth was poised. At church, she sang the hymns with clear voice and perfect posture. But the women of Wilkinson County remembered her differently. How she avoided eye contact, how her hands shook during communion, how she once left the service mid-sermon after the preacher spoke of forgiveness. Her maid, a young woman named Dinah, later told a neighbor, as recorded in a WPA account decades later. "Miss Elizabeth, she talked to herself at night. Say she hear the Lord whisperin'. Say he tell her the master's soul been traded. She throw the Bible once, broke the lamp. Next mornin', she say it was the wind." By 1847, she had become a ghost in her own house, haunting the halls while her husband and Isaac worked side by side. Isaac's role grew, and so did the unease. The neighboring planters muttered that Whitlock had gone soft. Some refused to trade with him. The church elders began to visit more often, asking veiled questions about the management of his servants. But Silas only smiled that slow, distracted smile, and said, "I answer to God, not to men." And yet, in his letters, those few that survived, you can see the shadow creeping in. "The nights are long here," he wrote to a friend in New Orleans. "There is a sound in the rafters that I cannot place. Elizabeth prays, Isaac listens, and I wonder if prayer is only another form of vanity." Another letter, undated but likely from 1848, contains this line: "Isaac asked me if a man can serve two masters and remain one soul. I had no answer for him." By that winter, Silas's health began to fail. His complexion turned gray, and his appetite waned. Dr. Wren from Natchez was summoned. He prescribed laudanum and rest, noting privately that the master's pulse was feeble and irregular. But servants whispered another story, that Silas had been found wandering the fields at midnight, barefoot, murmuring words in a tongue no one understood, that he stopped eating bread and salt, that he refused to sleep in the same bed twice. Isaac remained at his side through it all, silent and watchful. Mary Bell, the cook's daughter who was 12 at the time, remembered years later, "Mr. Silas, he looked hollow, like he'd unseen the end. Isaac, he follow him everywhere, like a shadow. When master took sick, Isaac sit by him all night. Some folks say he prayin'. Some say he watchin' to make sure he don't wake." And then there was the night of the fire. In December 1848, a blaze broke out in the Plantation smokehouse. It burned quick and clean, taking with it the dried meats and the walls of the shed. No one was hurt, but when the ashes cooled, they found something strange in the soot. 7 iron nails arranged in a circle and a strip of linen marked with handwriting. The handwriting was Silas's. It read, "To bind is to own, to free is to owe." The sheriff called it foolishness, The doctor called it delirium. But Elizabeth stopped speaking for 3 days afterward. When she did, it was to Isaac. "Tell me what you've done to him," she said. He didn't answer. She struck him hard across the face. He only turned and walked away. Weeks later, Silas Whitlock died in his sleep. No witnesses, no last words. The doctor declared heart failure. But in her private notes, Elizabeth wrote, "I woke to find him cold." Isaac stood at the foot of the bed staring. He said the Lord had taken him gently, yet when I touched my husband's hand, it was warm still. The funeral was swift. The coffin was closed. The will was read 2 days later in the parlor, beneath the portrait of Silas's father. Elizabeth sat rigid in her chair, lace veil drawn low, her fingers digging into the fabric of her skirt as the words were spoken aloud. "All lands, holdings, and worldly possessions to my man Isaac." When the clerk read the next line, "My wife Elizabeth shall have nothing," she did not faint, as the later accounts claimed. She stood. "Nothing," she whispered. "Nothing?" Her voice rose, sharp as glass. "He has bewitched this house," she cried. "You think this paper means anything? It's not his hand that wrote it, it's the devil's." The clerk and witnesses hurried her out. Isaac remained seated, unmoving. Only his eyes followed her as she was dragged from the room. After that day, no one saw Elizabeth again in public. What followed were rumors. Wild, impossible rumors. That Elizabeth tried to burn the will, but the parchment would not catch flame. That she attempted to leave the house, only to find her carriage wheels mired in mud no one else could see. One story says she wandered the fields barefoot, calling her husband's name until her voice gave out. Another that she took a knife to Isaac's chest and found the blade would not pierce his skin. None of these can be proven, but all share the same ending. By spring, she was gone. Some said she fled north. Some said she drowned herself in the river. But the freedmen who later lived on that land believed something different. They said her spirit never left, that on cold nights you could still hear her pacing the old veranda, whispering prayers into an empty house. And Isaac? After the funeral, he simply disappeared. No record of manumission, no deed transfer, no burial. Only a single entry, scrawled in the county ledger in another man's hand. Property of Whitlock estate, now under possession of the man called Isaac. Then nothing. For nearly a century, his name lay dormant, until that Bible was found. And with it, the question that has haunted Wilkinson County ever since. What did Silas Whitlock owe his slave that he would give him everything, and damn his wife to nothing? The first sign that something was wrong on the Whitlock estate came not with blood, but with silence. After Silas Whitlock's funeral, the plantation changed. The workers spoke less. The fields grew strange. Patches of cotton that refused to bloom. Others that sprouted white in the dead of winter. The overseer, a man named Pritchard, lasted barely 2 weeks before packing his trunk and leaving without a word. He didn't even collect his pay. Neighbors noticed the difference when they passed by on the road. The chimneys no longer smoked. The window shutters stayed closed, even at midday. The bell that had always rung for supper now hung crooked and rusted, like a tooth gone black. By April, the mansion stood almost empty. Elizabeth Whitlock was still there, or so people said, though few saw her. The slaves avoided the main house entirely. The few who were forced to enter claimed they heard voices upstairs, speaking in tones too low to make out. "Sounded like Mr. Silas," one of them told the sheriff later, like he was reading to her again. The sheriff wrote it off as grief. But grief doesn't make the clock stop. And on that property, every clock did. On the same night, at the same hour, midnight, May 2nd, 1849. The following morning, a field hand named June Carter found something strange by the creek. It was a set of footprints, bare, small, the shape of a woman's feet, leading straight into the water and stopping there. No prints leading out. In her hand, June held a small handkerchief embroidered with white thread. She recognized the initials instantly. E.W. She took it to the house, knocking on the back door. No one answered. She waited, listening. The house was still. Too still. She turned to leave when something inside moved. A soft dragging sound, like fabric being pulled across the floor. "Miss Elizabeth?" June called. Nothing. Then the piano began to play. It was slow, halting, 2 or 3 notes at a time, then silence, then a chord so sharp it made her flinch. June dropped the handkerchief and ran. 2 days later, Reverend Lyle came to the plantation at the request of the local magistrate. He found Elizabeth in the parlor, seated by the window, a shawl over her shoulders though the air was warm. Her eyes were hollow. She was thinner, her skin waxy. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said softly, taking off his hat. "The town is worried for you." She didn't look up. "The town should pray for itself." "Ma'am, you haven't been seen at service for—" "The Lord does not live in that house anymore, Reverend." He hesitated, glancing at the walls. The air smelled faintly of smoke and something else. Something sweet and rotten, like meat left in the sun. "You mustn't stay alone," he said. "The staff says you—" "They say I what?" Her voice sharpened, brittle as glass. "That you speak with your husband." Elizabeth turned then, meeting his eyes. "He speaks to me, not as before, but as he was before that man came." "You mean Isaac?" She shuddered as though the name itself were a wound. "Don't say it in this house." "Why?" "Because he hears it." The Reverend left shaken, promising to send help. But by the time he returned 3 days later, the house was locked, the doors barred from the inside. The chimney smoke had ceased again. From that point on, the Whitlock estate became the subject of endless speculation. Some said Elizabeth had taken ill and was being cared for by the remaining servants. Others whispered that she'd gone mad, that she slept in the library beside her husband's portrait, talking to it through the night. Children dared one another to walk past the gate after dark. They claimed you could see a candle flicker in the upstairs window even when the rest of the house was dark. And sometimes, if you stood still enough, you could hear faint singing. By early June, the sheriff received complaints from nearby farmers. Strange sounds carried through the valley, distant chanting, the tolling of a bell that wasn't there, and once, the unmistakable cry of a woman, long, piercing, echoing over the river. The sheriff rode out one morning to investigate. The fields were deserted. Near the back fence, he found something that made his stomach turn. A wooden cross, freshly carved, tied with red twine and driven into the earth. Etched into the wood were letters so faint he could barely read them. "Deliver me." He took it as a sign of hysteria. People said he left the cross lying where it was and rode straight back to town, refusing to speak of it again. Weeks passed. Then, in late summer, lightning struck the old pecan tree near the riverbank. It split clean down the center, burning from within. Inside its trunk, the farmhands discovered something impossible. A folded scrap of parchment, pressed deep into the wood like a fossil. It bore the same handwriting as Silas Whitlock's will. It was never meant for her. The men buried it, terrified. But that night the dogs began to howl. The slaves who remained on the property gathered near the quarters, too afraid to enter the main house. Isaac had been gone for months, but his presence lingered like a shadow. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the shutters, seemed to carry his name. One woman claimed she saw him standing by the cornfield at dusk. "He didn't look right," she said years later. "He wasn't breathing right. His chest weren't moving, but his eyes was watching the house, not the land." Another said she found his old tools arranged neatly in a circle outside the barn. The ground beneath them burned black, though there had been no fire. By autumn, the plantation was all but abandoned. The crops failed completely, the soil turning gray and brittle. Elizabeth's relatives in Natchez sent men to collect her, but they returned empty-handed, saying they found the front doors open and the house empty. On the dining table lay a single object, a Bible, its pages torn and smudged with ash. Inside, on the last page, someone had written in a shaking hand, "He comes for what was promised." For decades afterward, the Whitlock property stood in ruin. The Civil War came and went. Soldiers marched past its fields and refused to camp there. Freedmen built shanties on the edge of the land, but moved within weeks, claiming the ground whispered at night. A traveler passing through in 1871 described the place in a letter to the Natchez Courier. "The air is foul, like a grave open too long. I saw the chimney still standing, the bricks blackened, and heard the faintest strains of a hymn carried by the wind. There was no one there. Yet, for a moment, I thought I saw a woman standing in the second-story window. She vanished before I could look again." In 1892, a team of prospectors surveying the land for oil discovered a strange artifact near the ruins of the main house, a rusted key, heavy, hand-forged, engraved with two sets of initials, SW and IW. When they presented it to the county clerk, he refused to log it. "Throw it back where you found it," he told them. "Some doors are better left locked." They laughed. They didn't understand. That night, one of the men woke to the sound of knocking on his cabin door, 3 times, slow and deliberate. When he opened it, no one was there, only the key, lying on the step where he'd left it. And so the story twisted itself through time, half legend, half confession. By the early 1900s, the name Whitlock had become a warning. Children were told not to play near the old property, lest the master's debt find them too. Farmers claimed their plows broke on stones that weren't there, and more than one traveler swore they saw a figure walking the fields at dusk. A tall man, shoulders broad, hat in hand, humming softly to the dying light. No one ever saw his face. But they all agreed on one thing. He was walking toward the house. The county records tell nothing of Isaac after 1849. Not one trace, no birth, no death, no deed of emancipation. Yet his name is carved faintly into a single surviving rafter from the old mansion, recovered decades later when the ruins were torn down. Just 3 words, scratched into the beam with the precision of a craftsman. He kept his word. The past does not rest easily in Wilkinson County. Even now, when the air turns humid and the river runs high, locals say the fields whisper with voices. Sometimes they're praying, sometimes they're pleading. And sometimes, if you listen closely, you can hear a man saying the same words over and over, soft and steady, like a vow that never died. To free is to owe. The will, the missing bodies, the impossible inheritance. It all seems like folklore until you touch the documents yourself. The parchment still exists, locked in the county archive, the ink brown with age, but the words clear as the day they were written. It bears the same signature found on Silas Whitlock's marriage certificate, the same hand that signed the land grants, the same hand that damned his wife and gave his soul to another. By 1904, the last remaining trace of the Whitlock estate was the foundation stone, half buried, cracked, covered in moss. The rest had rotted into the earth. swallowed by vines and time. But Wilkinson County never forgot the story. And in that year, the story came crawling back to life. It began with a man named Dr. Benjamin Clark, a historian from Louisiana who came to Mississippi to document the remnants of antebellum plantations. He was a careful man, reserved, more scientist than dreamer, but he was also hungry for legacy, desperate to find something the world hadn't already catalogued. When Clark arrived, he carried letters of introduction from Tulane University and a notebook bound in brown leather. His intention was simple: to write a paper about lost Southern estates and their cultural memory. But when he visited the county clerk's office in Woodville, the clerk, a gray, cautious man named Harlan Reese, grew uncomfortably quiet at the mention of the Whitlock name. "You'd best leave that one be," Reese said, closing the ledger he'd been writing in. "There's nothing there but bones and bad luck." Dr. Clark smiled politely. "That's usually where the truth hides, Mr. Reese." The clerk sighed and stood, wiping his hands on his vest. "You want to see it? You'll find it 6 miles past the old ferry road. Don't go alone. And if you hear someone talking to you when there ain't no one around, don't answer." The next morning, Clark set out with his assistant, a young student named Henry Lyle, whose great-grandfather had once been enslaved in the same county. The road to the property was little more than a trail now, overgrown, choked by cypress and briar. The day was thick with heat. Cicadas screamed from the trees. The river stank of silt and stagnant water. By the time they reached the ruins, the sun was low. The house was gone, but the ground still bore its shape, the faint outline of the old foundation stones, the remnants of the brick chimneys rising like broken teeth. Henry stood still for a long moment. "You feel that?" "Feel what?" Clark asked. "The ground. It's colder here." Clark crouched, touching the soil. He frowned. The boy was right. Though the sun still burned hot on their backs, the earth beneath his palm was cool, almost damp. They unpacked their instruments, tape measures, notebooks, a camera. Clark moved from ruin to ruin, sketching foundations, noting measurements, but Henry drifted toward the tree line. Something had caught his eye. A small wooden cross, half-rotted, still tied with a scrap of red twine. "Doctor," Henry called, "you need to see this." Clark joined him, brushing dirt from the wood. He squinted. The carving was faint, but legible. "Deliver me." Henry stepped back. "You ever seen that before?" Clark didn't answer. He recognized the words immediately, from a 19th century court transcript he'd read years earlier, one tied to the Whitlock probate. The same plea had been found carved into the cross recovered by the sheriff in 1849. He felt something tighten in his chest. "Mark it down," he said quietly. "We'll dig here tomorrow." That night they camped beside the ruins. The air grew heavy with mist, and the woods hummed with insects. Clark lay awake, listening to the sounds, the chirp of crickets, the distant croak of frogs, the low hiss of the river. Then came something else, faint, rhythmic. He sat up. It sounded like hammering. He looked toward the dark outline of the chimneys. The sound grew sharper, metal striking wood, steady, deliberate. "Henry?" he whispered. No answer. He stood, lantern in hand, and walked toward the noise. As he neared the foundation, the sound stopped. The night went still. And then, from somewhere deep in the ruins, a voice murmured, soft, slow, the words stretched out like prayer. "To free is to owe." Clark froze. He turned the lantern in a slow circle, the light slicing through mist and shadow. Nothing. Only the empty ruins and the faint smell of ash. When he returned to the tent, Henry was sitting upright, eyes wide. "You heard it too," the boy said. Clark swallowed. "Yes." The next morning they began digging. They worked in silence for hours, the shovels biting into the earth. The soil was dense, mixed with charcoal and stone. Around noon, Henry's shovel struck something hard. He crouched, clearing the dirt with his hands. "Wood," he said. "Old." Clark knelt beside him, brushing gently. Beneath the layer of soil was a small wooden box, rotted but intact, no larger than a Bible. He pried the lid open with the edge of his trowel. Inside was a folded piece of parchment, blackened by age. The ink was faded, but a few words were visible. "I bind this to him who walks between light and mercy." Beneath the words was a symbol, 3 interlocking circles. Henry took a step back. "What is that?" Clark didn't answer. He was staring at the symbol, tracing it in the air. He'd seen it before. In a 1901 theological treatise on Southern folk religion, there was mention of a secret mark used by the enslaved in certain regions, a circle of covenant, a blend of Christian Trinity and African cosmogram, meant to represent a pact between 2 souls, equal only in death. He folded the parchment and slipped it into his satchel. "We're done for today." That night, Henry refused to sleep. "I don't like this place," he said, his voice shaking. "Feels like somebody's watching." Clark looked up from his notes. "That's superstition." "Then how come the cricket stopped?" Clark listened. He realized, suddenly, that the boy was right. The night had gone silent. Completely. And then came the smell. It drifted through the air, thick, metallic, unmistakable. The smell of iron and decay. Henry gagged. "What is that?" Clark rose, lantern trembling in his hand. The smell was coming from the ruins. He stepped forward, light flickering over the black stones, and stopped dead. The foundation stones were wet, slick with something dark. Blood. It ran from between the cracks, seeping into the earth. Henry fell to his knees, whispering a prayer. "Lord, have mercy." Clark staggered backward, his mind racing. There were no animals, no wounds, no source. The stones themselves were bleeding. He forced himself to breathe, to think. "It's the groundwater," he muttered. "Iron deposits, that's all." But the words sounded false even to him. The air grew colder. The mist thickened. And then, faintly, from the trees, came a voice, soft and steady, repeating the same words over and over. He kept his word. By dawn, they were gone. The sheriff found the camp abandoned, the tent flattened, the tools scattered. Clark's notebook lay open on the ground, pages soaked through with dew. Only one entry had been written after midnight. "The debt is alive." Neither Clark nor Henry was ever seen again. The incident might have been forgotten, filed away as another Southern ghost story, if not for what happened next. In 1912, a storm unearthed part of the old foundation, revealing a brick-lined chamber beneath the ruins. The workers who found it refused to go inside, but one man, a drifter named Caleb Trenton, did. He returned an hour later, pale and shaking. "There's bones down there," he said. "Ain't animal bones neither." He led the sheriff back to the site. They pried open the bricks and climbed down into the chamber. The air was thick, wet, and foul. Their lanterns flickered. Against the far wall sat 2 skeletal figures, one small, one tall, sitting side by side, their hands clasped. On the wall behind them, carved deep into the brick, were words written in Latin, "Libertas per debitum," freedom through debt. The sheriff ordered the chamber sealed. The bones were buried in a single grave marked only unknowns. But the story spread fast. The newspapers printed it, calling it the Whitlock Curse Unearthed. Reporters came from New Orleans, Atlanta, even New York. Most dismissed it as myth, but one photograph, taken before the chamber was sealed, showed something the others missed. Behind the skeletons, etched faintly into the wall between them, were initials. SWIW, Silas Whitlock, Isaac Whitlock. From there, suspicion turned inward. The county historians began combing through archives, trying to piece together what had truly happened in 1849. They found inconsistencies, vanished witnesses, and missing records. The will's two witnesses, both listed as field overseers, were never seen again after Silas's death. The probate judge who signed off on the inheritance died suddenly 2 months later, struck by what his physician called a nervous seizure. And then there was the church record, buried deep in Reverend Lyle's journals. Visited Mrs. Whitlock, late of Wilkinson County. Confessed that her husband had spoken with her from beyond. Claimed the man Isaac was not mortal but bound to him. She begged for deliverance, saying the pact was made with words she could not understand. Advised her to pray. She said it was too late. He already had the key. The Reverend's handwriting grew erratic toward the end of that entry. The ink blotted and smeared. The next page was blank. In 1934, when the Bible containing the will was found, the last living witness to those events was an elderly black woman named Eloise Turner. She was 96 years old, nearly blind, and living in a shack near Port Gibson. When a journalist from Jackson came to interview her, she spoke slowly, her voice thin but steady. "You ask about Mr. Silas," she said. "I remember him. I remember the night he died too. They say he just stopped. But I seen him standing at the window, talking to the dark." "To the dark?" the journalist asked. Eloise nodded. "That's where Isaac was, waitin'. The master called him up from it, called him brother, said the land was theirs now, both of 'em, but one had to stay. Which one stayed?" She smiled, toothless and sad. "Depends which one you ask." For generations, the locals told two versions of the tale. In one, Silas was a repentant man, a master who freed his slave out of love or guilt, who paid with his life for crossing the line between master and equal. In the other, he was a coward who bartered his soul for power, who saw in Isaac something immortal and tried to bind it for himself. But both versions end the same way, with two men joined by a promise too heavy to bear. In the late 1940s, the land was sold to a timber company. The new owners leveled the soil, planted pine. The ruins disappeared completely beneath the trees. And yet, workers reported strange occurrences. Chains found hanging from branches 30 feet above ground. Small wooden carvings, crosses, faces, animals, left on stumps overnight. A foreman claimed to hear footsteps following him through the woods, though he was alone. One morning, a logging crew discovered a tree split open by lightning. Inside its hollow trunk lay a single object, an iron key, blackened but unbroken. Stamped into its handle were 3 interlocking circles. They turned it into the county. No one claimed it. "What do you think?" the narrator might ask here, the voice soft and cold. "Guilty souls cursed by God, or victims of madness? Tell us below. Your theories matter here." In the archives of Wilkinson County, there remains one final letter, never mailed, unsigned, written in a hand so trembling it's barely legible. It was found among the old probate records, folded into a hymnal. It reads, "He told me the debt was settled, that freedom was not a gift but a trade, that every soul who owned another must pay in kind. I saw his eyes as he said it, gray as ash, full of mercy and ruin. He was no longer master nor slave. He was the reckoning." And still, some nights, the locals swear they see lights moving through those woods, lanterns swinging in the dark. a man's voice humming a tune too old to name. The forest grows thick now, reclaiming what was once stolen. But the ground remembers. It remembers every chain, every name, every word. And beneath it, the debt waits, patient, eternal, and owed. If you stood in that room, the voice might whisper, low and haunted, would you call it crime or sacrifice? Leave your answer. Time blurs where the Whitlock land once stood. Seasons move over it, but the air never feels right. In summer, the soil stays cold. In winter, you can smell rot where there should be nothing but pine. By the middle of the 20th century, the story had settled into the kind of legend only old counties can keep alive, too detailed to be fiction, too impossible to be truth. Then came Margaret Ashford. She was a journalist out of Baton Rouge, a writer for Southern Chronicles, a magazine known for its investigative features about forgotten history. She was not a believer in curses or ghosts. Her editor had sent her to Wilkinson County to write a human interest piece about the rediscovery of the Whitlock property. The new owners planned to turn it into a historic site, complete with walking trails and plaques. Get me something atmospheric, her editor had said. Ghosts, old money, antebellum scandal. Readers eat that up. Margaret had rolled her eyes and packed her camera. She arrived in November 1953, a cold month even for Mississippi. The sky hung low and gray, the trees bare. The new owner, a local entrepreneur named Earl Hammond, met her at the property gate. He was a loud man with a salesman's grin and whiskey breath. They say this land's cursed, he told her proudly. But I don't put stock in that. I'm turning it into a tourist park. Folks'll pay good money to see a haunted plantation. Margaret nodded politely. And you found the foundations? Oh, yes, he said. We got the archaeologists in. Found bits of brick, some pottery, even a key. A key? Yeah, funny little thing. Got 3 rings carved into it, probably decorative. Her stomach went cold. May I see it? Sure, he said, fishing it from his coat pocket. Can't open a damn thing with it, but it's got character. He handed it to her. It was heavier than she expected, cold to the touch. The metal was blackened, the rings smooth from handling. 3 circles, she murmured. Hammond grinned. Some kind of Masonic thing, maybe. Margaret didn't answer. She slipped the key into her bag. That night, she stayed in a small boarding house in Woodville. Her room smelled of lemon polish and coal dust. She sat by the window, reading through copies of the old court records she'd collected from the archive. Silas Whitlock's will. The missing witnesses. The doctor's notes. All pointing to one conclusion. Whatever had happened on that land had not been human justice. As she read, she felt the faintest vibration beneath her chair like a wagon passing far off, though the street outside was empty. She stood, crossed to the window. The trees along the road swayed gently, though there was no wind. And then she saw it, a light, deep in the woods to the west. A soft yellow glow, like a lantern moving through the trees. She blinked, looked again. The light was gone. The next morning she returned to the property. The air was damp and heavy with fog. Hammond's work crew hadn't yet arrived, so she walked the land alone, camera in hand. She found the old brick foundation easily a ring of charred stone half swallowed by moss. She crouched beside it, brushing away dirt, when her fingers touched something smooth, and it was a small wooden carving, no larger than her palm, the shape of 2 hands clasped together, carved with astonishing detail. The wood was dark and oily, and on the back, faintly scratched, were initials. S.W. I.W. Margaret's breath caught. She turned the carving over again. The hands were intertwined so tightly that it was impossible to tell which belonged to whom. A movement flickered in the corner of her eye. She looked up. The fog had thickened. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing. Tall, still. "Hello?" she called. No answer. She stepped forward, but when the mist thinned, the figure was gone. The only sound was the slow, rhythmic creak of a rope swinging somewhere above her. She turned toward the noise and froze. Hanging from the limb of an ancient pecan tree was a set of rusted shackles, swaying gently in the air. That night, Margaret developed her photographs in the boarding house darkroom. Most of them came out grainy, fogged from the humidity, but one made her pause and In the shot of the ruins, near the center of the frame, a faint shape hovered between the trees, the silhouette of a man. No features, no face, but behind him, at the edge of the image, the faintest suggestion of another figure smaller. A woman, her face turned toward the ground. Margaret stepped closer, heart pounding. Between them, faintly illuminated by the camera's flash, was a symbol scratched into the dirt, 3 circles intertwined. She dropped the photo, trembling. The radio in the next room hissed to life, though she hadn't turned it on. A voice low, distant, warped by static, whispered. He kept his word. She left the next morning intending to return to Baton Rouge, but something pulled her back. That key, the carving, the photograph. She couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't finished, that someone or something still wanted to be heard. So she went back one last time. The woods were darker than before, the fog heavier. The air felt thick, pressing against her skin. She carried the key in one hand, her camera in the other. At the edge of the ruins, she stopped. The ground beneath her feet was damp, the soil black. She knelt, holding up the key. "Silas Whitlock," she said softly. "Isaac, whoever you are, what do you want me to see?" The key grew warm in her hand. Then, from beneath the earth, came a sound faint at first, then louder. The creak of wood, the shift of stone, as if something were turning beneath her. The ground split open. A narrow crack, no wider than a man's arm, running straight through the old foundation. From it rose a thin gray mist. Inside, she saw steps, brick steps, descending into darkness. Margaret hesitated, trembling. Then she took her flashlight and stepped down. The stairwell was cold. The air smelled of iron and mildew. At the bottom was a small room, maybe 10 feet square, its walls slick with moisture. A single object sat in the center, a wooden chest, black with age. The lid was engraved with 3 circles. She knelt, pressing the key into the lock. It turned easily, the mechanism smooth despite its age. Inside were bones. Not just one skeleton, 2, intertwined, the arms wrapped around each other. Their skulls faced upward, mouths open, as though frozen mid-breath. Beneath them lay a folded piece of parchment. Margaret reached in and lifted it, careful not to tear the fragile paper. The writing was faded but legible. "This is our covenant, not of blood, but of debt. To own a soul is to owe it. I give mine freely, that he may walk, and I may rest." Beneath the text were 2 signatures. Silas Whitlock, Isaac Whitlock. The paper slipped from her fingers. She backed away, staring. The bones seemed to shift, the hands tightening around each other. Then she heard it. A heartbeat. Slow, heavy, not hers. The air grew colder. The lantern flickered. A voice rose from the shadows, deep, layered, 2 voices speaking as one. "He freed me, and I freed him." Margaret turned, but the stairwell was gone. The walls had closed in. The air was thick, suffocating. The voice came again. Closer now. We are bound until the debt is paid." She screamed, but the sound died in her throat. The lantern burst, plunging her into darkness. And in that darkness, she saw them two figures standing side by side, pale eyes glinting in the black. "Tell them," the voice said. "Tell them the truth." Then, nothing. 3 days later, the county sheriff found her car abandoned by the road. Her camera lay on the passenger seat, film undeveloped. They never found her body. But inside the camera, one photograph survived. A blurred image of the ruins, the ground cracked open, mist rising from below, and in the center, faint but unmistakable, the shape of two figures standing side by side. Their hands were clasped. For decades afterward, strange events plagued the new owners of the land. The visitor center Hammond built burned down in 1954. The night watchman claimed he saw a man of smoke walking the halls just before the fire started. In the 1960s, a highway crew rerouting the nearby road unearthed another iron key identical to the first. They threw it into the river. The next morning, it was back on the asphalt, lying in the exact center of the new lane. By the 1980s, the county had fenced the land off entirely, but on humid nights, truckers driving past swore they saw lanterns moving between the trees. Some even claimed to see a woman standing by the road, her dress soaked, her hands clasped around something they couldn't see. When they stopped to look, she vanished. The Whitlock story became folklore, again retold in whispers, stripped of names, changed to suit the teller. Some said it was about love that defied law. Others said it was about a curse, a pact with death. But the real horror was simpler, colder. It was the debt. A system built on ownership could not end without payment. Every master owed, every soul bound. And on that land, Silas Whitlock had tried to settle the account. He freed the man he'd once owned, not as an act of mercy, but as an offering. And in doing so, he gave Isaac the one thing no man can give another, his own soul. The will had not been a legal document. It was a contract written in ink, sealed in blood, witnessed by silence. When historians study the old papers today, they point to an anomaly. The ink used in Silas Whitlock's will contains trace elements not found in any known 19th century formulation. Iron, sulfur, and something else, an organic compound consistent with human blood. The signature wasn't written with a pen. It was written with a blade. To this day, the county keeps the will locked away in a climate-controlled vault. No one is allowed to touch it. But archivists who handle the files say that the paper sometimes feels warm. And if you hold it long enough, you can hear a faint sound, a heartbeat, slow and steady, pulsing through the parchment. The land is quiet now, overgrown with pine and honeysuckle. The ruins are gone, the graves unmarked. But sometimes, when the wind turns, the air carries a sound not crying, not singing, but something in between. A voice murmuring, old and tired, echoing through the trees. To free is to owe. The years after the last disappearance turned the Whitlock legend into something colder than ghost stories, something that lived in courthouse drawers, in the uneasy laughter of historians, in the silence of descendants who refused to speak of bloodlines. In 1962, the Mississippi Historical Society attempted to publish a formal report titled The Whitlock Covenant, a case study in antebellum legal anomalies. The paper never saw print. The lead researcher, Dr. John Merriman, died in his office before the manuscript was completed. The coroner listed the cause as heart failure. His secretary said that, just before he died, she'd heard him speaking softly to himself, repeating one phrase over and over, "The ink won't dry." When they found him, his hands were stained dark red, On the desk before him lay the original transcription of the Whitlock, Will the Edges Damp, though the building was bone dry. The document was sealed again and removed from public access. In the decades that followed, the Plantation story became a quiet obsession among academics and folklorists. Every few years, a new theory emerged. Some said Silas Whitlock had fallen victim to fevered religious delusion that he'd come to believe freeing Isaac would redeem him before God. Others claimed the will was forged by abolitionists after his death to scandalize the South's planter class. But neither theory explained the handwriting analysis that confirmed the signature as authentic, or the consistent witness accounts that placed Isaac Whitlock by Silas's side on the day he died. Nor could anyone explain how two skeletons, found a century later, bore identical healed fractures, the same break in the right collarbone, the same faint groove on the left wrist, as though both men had once worn the same shackle. In the archives of Tulane University, an unsigned field note still sits in the margins of an unpublished thesis about Southern estate law. It reads, "Perhaps it was not master and servant, but halves of one whole, a debt owed and paid, and never closed." For the people of Wilkinson County, the land was never the same. The timber company that bought it went bankrupt in 1965 after a series of accidents, falling trees, missing workers, a fire that burned for 3 days and never spread beyond the boundaries of the old plantation. The county bought the land back for pennies. The area was fenced off and designated protected woodland. No one lives within 2 miles of it now. Children grow up hearing the story from their grandparents how the master left everything to his slave, how the earth remembers promises men were never meant to make. They dare each other to sneak through the fence on Halloween, to leave a coin or a nail by the gate and listen. They say if the air goes cold, if the wind dies, if you hear the sound of a hammer striking wood in the distance, you've trespassed on a debt that still isn't paid. In 1998, a group of graduate students from LSU returned to the site to conduct an audio survey of the area, an experiment to record ambient sounds and compare them to natural wildlife frequencies. For most of the night, their equipment captured nothing unusual. Then, at 2:14 a.m., the temperature dropped 10 degrees. The forest went silent, and the recorders caught a low voice, barely audible, repeating 3 words. "He kept it." When analyzed later, the voice did not match any member of the research team. The recording was never released publicly. Every few years, someone still writes about the Whitlocks, usually in academic journals or local magazines. But the details change each time, as though the story itself resists being told. In one version, Silas and Isaac are portrayed as friends, men who found grace in defiance of the law. In another, they are adversaries, locked in a battle of pride and guilt. In the oldest oral retellings, however, they are both victims of the same sin: ownership. And that is what gives the story its terrible power. Because it is not a tale of haunting alone. It is the memory of a transaction the world still hasn't finished reckoning with, a system built on debt, on bodies, on the illusion that one soul can ever belong to another. Silas Whitlock's will is only the literal version of that curse ink made of blood, parchment made of flesh. The plantation was the altar. The land itself was the witness. And when he signed that will, he didn't just free one man. He bound 1,000. Today, the key with the 3 rings rests in a glass case at the Mississippi State Museum. No label explains it. Most visitors pass without looking twice, but sometimes, under the right light, a faint discoloration appears along the metal, a residue like rust, but darker, almost red. The curator says it's just oxidation. The janitor who locks up at night says otherwise. He swears that when the building is quiet, you can hear the faint sound of 2 men whispering near the case. The words are never clear, but they always end the same way. To free is to owe. when the state finally cleared the last legal record of the Whitlock estate in 2002. A clerk noticed something strange in the digital archive. Every attempt to delete the old file produced a duplicate. No matter how many times they erased it, the document reappeared, timestamped to the exact second of deletion. The IT department eventually purged the server. But 2 weeks later, a printed copy of the will appeared in the courthouse mailroom. No envelope, no return address. The ink still wet. No one ever claimed responsibility. The clerk who handled it left the job soon after. In his resignation note, he wrote only, "Some debts don't die." In Wilkinson County, they've stopped calling it cursed land. They call it the Quiet Acre now, a place where nothing grows and no one speaks too loud. Once a year, an old preacher drives down from Natchez, parks by the rusted gate, and reads aloud from the book of Exodus. He never stays long. He says he does it so they'll both rest. But when he drives away, the air behind him still hums low, steady, like a heartbeat buried deep in the ground. And so the story survives not as a ghost tale, but as a parable. A man who tried to buy redemption, a slave who inherited the world and bore its weight, a wife who prayed to a God that never answered. 3 souls tied together by the same truth: no freedom comes without cost. The documents, the key, the carvings, they're all relics of a single question that echoes far beyond Mississippi's red soil. Who truly owns a soul? The story of Silas Whitlock is not about ghosts. It's about what remains when justice never comes, when men mistake possession for power and freedom for favor. The land remembers every word written in blood. It remembers every oath signed in silence. And if you stand where the Whitlock house once stood, you can feel it, the hum underfoot, the pulse of a covenant still waiting to be paid. Isaac's name is lost to time, but his shadow endures. Silas's wealth turned to ash, but his sin never left the soil. And Elizabeth, the woman erased by both, still lingers in the margins, praying to a God who did not answer. Some debts end with death, others begin there. So what do you believe? Was this redemption or damnation disguised as love? Write your theory in the comments. If you want us to keep uncovering America's buried truths, the crimes, the hauntings, the reckonings written into our soil, like this video and subscribe for next week's story. Because history doesn't sleep. It waits.